Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Jonathan. I am working with the climate change team at the Regional Resource Center for Asia and the Pacific here at the Asian Institute of Technology. And I'm very excited to have you join here. We are hoping to have a few more trickle in, but also we'll be recording this session for future reference. And this will be hosted at the Asia Pacific Adaptation Information Platform website, which is very much in the process of increasing the number of very useful and insightful resources to help support all of you who may be involved in adaptation planning, to also have reference to information that can inform your work down the line. So I'm very excited to be the moderator for this session. We're very excited to have with us very experienced professional woman panel also who will be giving us a lot of insights into what we think is a very important topic in the years ahead, which is making sure that we increase the access of climate change adaptation finance to community decision makers and players to be able to actually access and control resources. But we'll explore a bit in the next minutes this topic to greater depth. And first off, I would like to welcome our director, Gilberto Borongan. Gilberto has been working for the Asian Institute of Technologies for many years and has a lot of experience in resource mobilization and technical expertise in bridging science and policy and building local capacities for responsible waste management in the Asia Pacific region. Gilberto, how are you? Thank you for joining the session, and maybe I can invite you to share a few words to begin the session.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for all the guests or participants here who is joining us. And on behalf of Asian Institute of Technology, the Regional Resource Center for Asian Pacific, we welcome you to this session and greetings from RCAP. Ms. Yoko Yoshida, Deputy Director of the Climate Change Adaptation at the Global Environment Bureau at the Ministry of Environment of Japan. Ms. May Tazin Ong, researcher, the International Institute for Environment and Development. Ms. Imelda Padtari, the Senior Advisor on Climate Change at Save the Children. And Ms. Pakama Tinpanga, Senior Researcher at the Thailand Environment Institute. A pleasant good afternoon to everyone. First, I would like we are grateful to the government of Japan, to the Ministry of Environment for providing us financial support through this project and UpCap and through this webinar. And thank you also to the respective colleagues who are present here, our partner organization for the support and making this session possible, where we will be listening to your share insights and also your depth experience in the region in this topic. Ladies and gentlemen, again, a very good day to all of you. So just a few notes that empowering community-based stakeholders to help drive climate change adaptation in the respective communities is indeed a key to meet the challenge. At the EITRCP, we are committed to bridging these gaps, the capacity gaps and dialogues among stakeholders to access resources for adaptation planning and implementation, including this climate finance. Through our experience, we witness difficulties linked to often burdensome procedures that deter local actors from being able to pursue and even access finance. With global climate funds like the Adaptation Fund, we have the Green Climate Fund, play a particular role in piloting and unlocking resources for this transformative action for adaptation. However, this pool of resources continues to fall short of investment needs, and even competition we observe is ever increasing in the current political and economic climate. More than ever, we need to learn the previous and ongoing efforts in order that we could identify flexible and adequate financial solution that can meet the scale and capabilities of stakeholders at the local level while investing in building both up. This is a good backdrop, good an avenue to share insight on this. It is important also to align efforts across all sectors of society to ensure that investment decisions from top down and can meet bottom-up approaches. I hope this session can help us further unpack some of the principles and possibilities to ensure that locally led adaptation efforts can drive our way to climate resilient communities in the years ahead. I wish us all a productive and successful webinar and a pleasant day to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilberto, and thank you for your kind words. We're very excited to have this conversation, and it wouldn't be possible without the support of the Japanese government, who is very generous, also not only in bridging climate finance globally, but also supporting a lot of the efforts that we are doing here at AIT, our CAP. And so I'm excited to invite Ms. Yuko Yoshida, who is the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Adaptation Office at the Global Environment Bureau of Japan's Ministry of Environment. Yoshida-san has solid experience in really promoting investments and international cooperation, including through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, for joining MOEJ. Yoshida-san, thank you for joining. How are you? And I can invite you to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm pleased to join in this seminar and a webinar. And then on behalf of the Ministry of the Environment, we are very pleased to see the AIT has been making lots of achievements and lots of good practices as well under the collaboration with MOEJ. And 2022 was a harsh reminder of the fact that climate change is an urgent and pressing issue. When you check the news, you would hear a lot of news stories of extreme weather events on us, such as devastating floods in Pakistan and extended heat waves in Europe. We have to face and make a united effort to the climate change impacts which seem to cause these extreme weather events. The Glasgow Climate Pact last year called for developed country parties to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptation to developing country parties for 2019 levels by 2025. Calls for scaling up adaptation finance are also becoming even stronger internationally. Japan would like to actively discuss how developed countries achieve this collective target. At the World Leaders Summit held at COP26, Prime Minister Kishida called on all parties to take ambitious climate change action and announced that Japan would double its assistance for adaptation to climate change to approximately $14.8 billion US, both in public and private finance in the 5 years to 2025. We also believe that it's important not only to contribute to financial support, but also to ensure that financial support is combined with concrete implementation of adaptation measures. In this context, technical assistance provided by Japan is important to implement adaptation measures in countries and regions vulnerable to climate change impacts. Just a few weeks away from COP27 in Egypt, where readers would focus on urgent and priority issues such as adaptation and climate finance. I hope that this session will invite critical reflections and serve as a reminder of the importance of empowering people in the front line of climate change impacts to access finance and resources to increase resilience in their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yoshida-san, for your kind words and again for your continued support of not only our work but just broadly really on climate finance and finding a lot of these efforts. Well, next I would like to invite a keynote speech, and I would like to introduce Ms. May Tassin Ong. It is a pleasure to have May join us as a keynote speech. May is a researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and she focuses recently on designing and delivering climate finance to least developed countries at different levels of governance. And recently, earlier this year, the IIED published a report that really tries to synthesize a lot of the topics that we are going to be discussing in the next hour or so. She's very interested in promoting equitable access to finance, supporting community empowerment, and has a lot of experience also engaging with different stakeholders in Southeast Asia to promote evidence-based decision-making and multi-stakeholder participation, as well as policy analysis to integrate gender considerations, social equity dimensions, really into kind of accessing resources. So May, it's great to have you in the panel. I'll just pass over the microphone to you, and thanks again for helping us kind of get our heads around these very important topics. So over to you.
Thank you everyone for having me, and thank you Jonathan for such a kind introduction. So my name is Medha Ao, and I am a climate finance researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And our work is very much focused on some of the things that we've discussed already about making sure that adaptation finance gets to the people that need it the most, working together with provider countries like Japan and other provider countries to ensure that there is greater quality of finance, but as well as quantity of finance. I will talk a little bit about the locally led adaptation principles, how they came about, what they are, and then discuss a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. I couldn't figure out how to go into presenter mode, so I will just talk if that's okay with all of you. Okay, so what is locally led adaptation? As we've already discussed today, the climate crisis is upon us and it requires a whole of society response. So particularly, we need to pay attention to local actors in least developed countries that suffer disproportionately from the impacts of climate change. So some of the research that we have at IIED has found that in the previous 50 years, more than 2/3 of worldwide deaths caused by climate-related disasters were in least developed countries. So this is a very daunting figure, and we need to put more of a focus on empowering least developed countries. And particularly within least developed countries, we have to put power into the hands of local actors who have first-hand experience of climate impacts, as well as local knowledge to find the solutions to have transformative climate adaptation action. As we've already discussed, access to finance is an issue. So in general, even for least developed countries between the periods 2013 to 2018, the least developed countries only received about 3% of the funds that they need in this decade to deal with adaptation issues. And we know from our research as well that only about 10% of the funds reach the local level. So these are women's organizations, cooperative groups, people that are at the frontier of climate change. So with these issues of access in mind, access to resources, as well as different power dynamics between developed countries and least developed countries, we developed the principles of locally led adaptation. These principles recognize that local actors need greater power as well as resources to effectively deal with the impacts of climate change and adapt in a way that is bespoke to their needs. So the principles of adaptation outline 8 main factors that are fundamental in empowering local actors and leading to more sustainable and effective adaptation. They were developed with IID, WI, and a range of lots of different organizations, over 50 organizations that include grassroots organizations, intermediaries, bilateral and multilateral adaptation funders. And they were officially launched in January 2021 at the Climate Adaptation Summit, and over 70 organizations have endorsed the principles. So let me run through the principles in a nutshell. As I mentioned, there are eight principles that capture 8 fundamental factors that we believe will empower local actors to lead sustainable and effective adaptation action. So these highlight things like access to resources, better access to finance, devolvement of decision-making to the most appropriate level. So it captures the need for localized, evolving, localized governance. It highlights the importance of strengthening capabilities of local institutions. It emphasizes that gender and social equity considerations are integral in addressing issues of power and ensuring that those that are the most impacted and most marginalized groups have access to the resources and are empowered to take action. And it also emphasizes the need for horizontal as well as vertical collaboration. So for example, on the devolvement and governance side, the principles highlight the need to devolve decision-making to the lowest appropriate level of decision-making. And so this will vary. This recognizes that contexts vary from place to place. And so that's why the lowest appropriate level of decision-making is emphasized. And this should consider ensuring that decision-making power over climate actions and access to finance go to the people that need it most. On the issue of
May, sorry, can I
Yeah.
interrupt very briefly? Just I'm getting some notes from the participants that if you can share your slides, even if it's not on presenter. Some folks
okay.
want to kind of have that as some sort of visual reference. So
Yes, I'm
sorry to
so sorry
interrupt.
about that.
No worries.
I'm not sure what you can see. Is it presenter mode or
It works. Yes, very, very, very well. Yes.
is it okay?
It looks perfect. So yes, please go
Okay,
ahead.
great.
Thank you.
So these are the 8 principles of locally led adaptation. And as I mentioned, they cover different topics from governance to delivery mechanisms that can improve access to finance. And they also emphasize things like the need for flexible programming and learning. So for example, principle number 3 is about patient and predictable funding. And principle number 6 is about flexible programming and learning. So these emphasize the different characteristics of localized climate financing that should be patient. So for example, providers should be patient with the way that they consider programming so that local actors who receive climate finance can learn and adapt and innovate. Funds should also be predictable, for example, so that it doesn't run out from year to year. I think many of us deal with the frustration of having 6-month-long extensions of funding for climate actions that inhibit our work actually and hinder some effective climate action. We also highlight things like investing in local capabilities. So we emphasize the need to ensure that local capabilities within institutions as well as individuals are long lasting, so that even when the project funding runs out, there is strong capabilities at the local level to continue the important work of climate adaptation. So I can share with you these slides and we can talk more about these principles of locally led adaptation more. But I'm very excited that in our discussion today, we will be talking about, we will have 3 different discussions that talk about 3 different elements of these principles. The first is on, I think, discussing the governance, devolving decision making. The second is more about patient and predictable financing, what the different mechanisms are that work or don't. And the last is about collaboration. What kind of collaboration do we need? Is it vertical? Is it horizontal to coordinate our efforts and leverage the work of others? So very excited that we will have these conversations today. And as a next step for the locally led adaptation principles, we want to learn about how they are working for you in the different contexts that that you're working in. We want to show providers that locally led adaptation should be financed and promoted, and it is empowering for local actors then that it can deliver transformative climate action. So if you're interested in learning more about the locally led adaptation principles, feel free to message me, may.fazil@ied.org. And if you're interested in endorsing as well, I can send you some more information. But that is it from my end. And I really hope that we have a fruitful discussion. And I'm very eager to learn about how LLA is working for you in different contexts.
Great. Thank you so much, May, for giving us that overview and introduction really to the principles of locally led adaptation and in some of the work that you guys have been doing at IIED in terms of actually inviting some critical thinking to really how to operationalize some of these on the ground. I believe in the chat box, there is also a link to one of the recent reports that IIED has recently published. And again, really, we're very excited to dive into a few of these principles and kind of invite a few reflections from our panel with regards to good example stories, lessons learned, some things that might be needed to really kind of scale up and unlock the types of funding that communities are needed. So May, I'll let you stand by, but also if you have any thoughts that you want to share during the discussions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll be super happy to invite you in. Also, if you have any things that you would like to add. But before we dive into the panel, I want to also say that I hope this conversation can be interacted with those who are joining as participants. So please do make sure that if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen in the WebEx room. And if you'd like to share any comments or stories, we do encourage that you also type into the chat box as well to share some of those. And I'll do my best to also try to follow up on this and raise them during a conversation. But again, I'm very excited to dive in then next into the panel rounds of discussions. And what we thought would be interesting was really to kind of focus on a few of these principles and try to kind of pick the brains of 2 very experienced supporters and professionals that are really working really on the ground with communities to identify and develop adaptation projects and solutions. So I'm very excited and honored to introduce our panelists. First, we have Imelda Patari. Imelda is a senior advisor on climate change at Save the Children Foundation, which really works globally and also has kind of its headquarters in Australia, if I am correct, working very much across different parts of the world. And Imelda has extensive experience really working on climate adaptation planning, including to access a variety of climate finance, including from the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and several other climate funds that are working to provide resources to communities and countries to build resilience. More recently, Imelda is supporting efforts to pipeline climate action projects, and if I understood correctly, is also kind of with a bit of a portfolio that focuses a bit more in the African region, but also has been very much involved in the Asia Pacific region over the years through her roles at various organizations, including the Red Cross, and projects really involving the Red Cross, ECO, which is a consultancy with specialization very much in supporting access to climate action funds like the Green Climate Fund, and several other organizations that I will be inviting Imelda's insights throughout our conversations to also kind of reflect on your very much experience over the years. And our second panelist is Ms. Pakamas Timpanga, who I'm very excited to also invite. Pakamas is a senior researcher at the Thailand Environment Institute, where she's leading a 5-year project on strengthening urban climate governance for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable societies, which is funded by the EU and very much focused on strengthening knowledge and technical skills among civil society organizations and local players in various parts throughout Thailand. This includes Khon Kaen, Udon Thani, Nong Khai, Songkhla, Patualung, and Satun provinces around Thailand. And Pakamas has very much a lot of experience in really trying to kind of dive in and really work with very local players. So kind of inviting very much the two perspectives of organizations that are very much operating at a global level, but very much integrating into community discussions and narratives, but also kind of very much on the ground and bottom-up efforts through a national organization like Thailand's Environment Institute. So Imelda, Pakamas, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. I'll do my best to give justice to your experiences and very much excited to pick your brains in terms of what you have learned over the years working in this line of work. And really much in preparation to this, I was listening to a conversation with Ms. Jacqueline Novogratz, who was the founder of Acumen Investment Fund. And I thought one of the things that she mentioned during that conversation was kind of inviting a way to consider capitalism and capital and investments. And she has this quote where she says that one of the things that through her work she has been trying to do is in kind of figuring out ways to use the tools of capital without being controlled by the tools of capital, and very much trying to create impact in communities to build resilience throughout their investments, following the impact investment model. And of course, one of the key areas in building local access and control of resources is very much with regards to building capacities at the local level to strengthen the abilities to not only understand but also address and identify solutions at the local level to that effect. So I thought we could spend the first few minutes kind of discussing the roles of capacity buildings, and invites a few of your reflections to that effect. So again, first is really kind of my way of understanding also this kind of concept of equity. If we think about the fact that a lot of these climate funds are very much channeled to national players or to even international organizations, and this kind of call for locally led adaptation kind of invites this equity concept of inviting resources that are kind of really grounded from kind of more grassroots level. So I'm curious, maybe Imelda, we can start with you. Over your years of working in communities and very much working throughout different types of projects, can you talk a little bit about your efforts and some examples on supporting increasing local capacities with communities to really kind of be able to engage meaningfully in these conversations? I think both goods and bad examples are always interesting to invite. So I'm just very curious on what comes to mind based on your experience.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for holding this session. It's very important, and I hope it's the start of many more conversations. So I wanted to make one small correction, if you don't mind, just to the introduction, because I am employed by Save the Children Australia, and you mentioned is at the headquarters, but actually it's not. There are many Save the Children's around the world. I'm sure many people on the call have possibly worked with us, I hope so. And there is Save the Children International, which is sort of like an umbrella, which is based in the UK. So the reason I'm mentioning this is because the work that I'm doing currently with Save the Children Australia is in respect to the Green Climate Fund. And Save the Children Australia is the accredited entity to that fund. So Save the Children Australia works on behalf of the whole organisation, members around the world, and where we operate around the world in many countries. The projects get funneled through Save the Children Australia, and we've got currently 12 GCF projects with a portfolio value of about $250 million, and then we'll have some more in the pipeline. So just wanted to clarify that arrangement. But focusing more now on the significant question that you asked, which is about local collaboration, local capacity, governance issues, etc. I can give you a couple of examples from the current work that we're doing. We have our first Green Climate Fund project approved this year in Vanuatu, and it is, we believe, the world's largest locally led adaptation project at the moment that really instills the values that and the principles that May was talking about, those 8 principles. So that project in Vanuatu is a 32 million project that is operating in partnership with the government, but very much bottom up. The monies will flow directly to the beneficiaries who need it the most, and those beneficiaries, the residents of Vanuatu, are highly exposed, as you know, being a small island developing state. There are 68 islands, I believe. Very small population, just under 300,000, and we're working with a large amount of those folks in this project, which will be scaled up later on. So we'll reach everyone, basically the entire Vanuatu population, all of whom live within about 1 kilometre from the coast. So as I say, you know, they're exposed to tropical cyclones, heat waves, sea intrusion, floods, you know, and droughts at different times of the year because of the variable shifting rainfall patterns. So we're working with the communities from the ground up. What we're doing in this, well, what we do is we look for what exists on the ground already. You know, what is existing at a local level in terms of community organisation or structures. They could be, in some parts that are more progressive, there could be already community-based disaster risk management groups or standing committees of some kind. In Vietnam, where I worked with the Norwegian Church Aid, working on the ground there were flood and storm committees that were already existing, for example. So in Vanuatu's case, there are some groups that already exist. So those are the community disaster and climate change committees. However, they need strengthening, you know, and we also need to link those committees through to the province and to the centre, not central government, not the other way down, but that way up, so that we can ensure that information flows, that community needs and prioritisation flows. But importantly, in this project, we are building community capacity and knowledge on climate risk information, so that communities can establish for themselves, you know, what are the most priority needs, be it related to food security, health, water security, child education, adult education, needs of those who are disabled. The communities establish for themselves their own priorities and climate responses and actions that are needed. including the identification of, budgeting and planning at the local level. And the local level, the most local level in Vanuatu is the area council. So that's the government structure. And that's what we're working with. We're working with the communities, making sure there's representation of gender equal, and also others that may be marginalised. And of course, Save the Children have a special focus on children. And at the moment, in current Green Climate Fund policy, there's really no concrete focus on children. Certainly in environmental safeguards policy, there is focus on gender, but not girls, not boys, So we focus especially on children and child's rights and children's needs as well. So we will be building community capacity in Vanuatu on climate information, on how to plan, how to budget for climate response, and how to improve livelihood incomes and investments through traditional livelihoods, which there is fishery and farm based, but possible entrepreneurial other activities, coastal products, island services, and looking at bringing in, renewable technologies so that there's opportunities for digitalization, for example. Perhaps I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, and can let me know if you want me to speak specifically about something else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Imelda, for sharing that, and very much congratulations. So thank you for the correction first off on Save the Children's arrangements, but also congratulations on getting the approval from the Green Climate Fund for this very, very transformational project. I think that's really interesting, really kind of how you model that approach to very much give the power of decision making to community players. I'm very curious to hear a little bit more about this technology aspect of how you're really kind of engaging those, because I know a lot of the kind of conversations in formulating adaptation activities are in the so-called last mile elements of really making sure information is reaching kind of the most vulnerable communities in real time or in kind of a timely manner, and mechanisms that may benefit from this information technology. So can you speak a little bit about that, kind of how, at least within this project, this is done, and whether you kind of comment a little bit on to what extent this is very much an integral component of how the setup is arranged?
Yeah, certainly. It's very integral. It's critical because there's not internet as such, through the fiber optics or anything like that in Vanuatu. Everything's by satellite. And so part of this project will include solar satellite driven technology, and also the supply of tablets to each of the area councils, and also, solar panels on schools to support, use of lights and groundwater pumping, and, with solar panels as well. So it's very critical because this is how we will connect communities to information. So when we have early warning systems in place, which are systems where communities, we engage with communities, being on the ground, understanding the changing environment around them, and their very powerful observations that we collect and feed back up to the Met services, but also what those community needs if they're farming and need to know, certain parameters of the conditions that are changing, or fisher folks, who want to ensure that their boats don't get damaged. When is the storm going to hit? Where is it going to hit? This is often associated with impact-based forecasting now. So we need that information in the hands of those who need it most, whether it be through mobile phones and WhatsApp messages, SMS messages, or through the tablets, so the area councils can then notify out, as well as radios. The traditional methods work very well in these island communities also. But yeah, that level of technology is critical, and we're building it into all of our projects, in fact. So I'm working, for example, in Sierra Leone at the moment on another project, which is a $27.5 million adaptation project, Also with coastal communities in this case who are exposed. Unfortunately, they've had high deforestation in the past, which has taken away the mangrove protection on the coast. But of course, the weather's changing. The climate is changing. They're experiencing more heat waves, which means that things like peppers, for example, are not growing so well anymore without inputs. Inputs cost money. And there are water scarcity issues. So there again, we're looking at technology solutions where we can, including research and development of drought-tolerant, salt-tolerant varieties, as we're seeing all over the world.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that much. I think it's it also kind of gives a very interesting leeway for me to invite our second panelist to chime in, because Akamas, if I understand correctly, a lot of the efforts that you're doing within the work of the project you're handling at the moment is very much to the effect of making sure that you're kind of creating a sense of literacy and understanding of the different climate impacts that local communities are facing and are can expected to face, and also engaging in a lot of capacity building activities. So I'm curious also to kind of invite your reflections a little bit on that topic. Maybe perhaps if you can comment a bit more also on what are some of the key areas in Thailand that seem to be very much kind of a gap in terms of where community organizations or actors are missing, you know, to be able to not only access resources, but be able to kind of control them from a finance perspective as well. I'll leave it there. Maybe invite your first round of thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. So let me just give you some background information. So I work for the Thailand Environment Institute. It's an NGO. It's a national NGO. So it's one of the oldest NGOs in Thailand. And I think, I mean, I find this question around accessing finance is really, you know, it applies to us as well, not just for the grassroots or community-based organizations. I mean, for us to access funding, we have to compete. We have to, you know, we work on proposals, and we have to look for financial, you know, finance opportunities for new projects all the time. But so the work I'm doing, the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years is, you know, I've been lucky enough to be able to access, well, funding for large projects. So yeah, I've been working on urban climate resilience, and in the past 10 years, I've had several big projects, so funded by different donors, and working in, so we work in secondary cities. We look at urbanization and climate resilience. So we engage directly with local multiple stakeholders. So we've been working with cities, but also city, you know, municipalities, local administrations, different government agencies and departments, but also with universities and civil society, community-based organizations. So we engage with them through capacity building activities and exercises. So we apply all these difficult climate concepts and frameworks at the local level. And so part of this capacity building is that we, you know, get municipalities and civil society to collaborate and to work together to assess vulnerability, but also using vulnerability information to plan for their adaptation or climate actions or resilience strategies. And so for us, I mean, I think it's interesting to hear, you know, like Save the Children, that you are the entity, accredited entity to be able to access Green Climate Fund. I mean, for us, I mean, we, you know, it's quite difficult to go through that whole process to access that large funding. I mean, you know, I've been lucky to get funding from different donors, but it's not that easy, because we still have to wait for calls for proposals, and then we have to go through this proposal development and you know, to compete to get funding. But So, I mean, that's just part of how we work at TEI. But the projects I get, what we do. So the current project I'm working now is it's slightly different from the previous projects. We are engaging directly with local civil society and community-based organizations in provinces in Thailand to for them to better understand the linkages between climate, but also how climate impacts and risk across as cross-cutting issues in development, in urbanization. So it's not just looking at the impacts of climate change. So part of the capacity building is that we when we develop projects, we try to allocate funding for local stakeholders to to develop intervention projects on climate actions or adaptation or resilience building. And what we have learned is that it's not just about understanding what climate is. It's not just about learning about climate impacts and the linkages between urbanization and climate and how urbanization is contributing to climate vulnerabilities. It's also about designing, developing intervention projects, but also about managing projects. So part of this capacity building is that we get local stakeholders to collaborate together. That usually they don't coordinate or collaborate across sectors. So we get local municipalities to work with government agencies and departments and civil society organizations to design and develop projects based on, say, like findings of their vulnerability assessments, to come up with climate actions or adaptation plans or resilience strategies. But I mean, for them to learn to even write proposals, I mean, I think that is part of the capacity building as well. That is needed. It's a big gap in at a local level with local civil society organizations, NGOs, especially for community-based or grassroots organizations to be able to design studies or projects, to access even small funding from our projects. So this is like, some allocation for, for them to be able to do something in terms of actions. So I think in terms of accessing even larger fund it's difficult for us. It would be very difficult for local organizations as well. And yeah, and I think part of this capacity building is about learning how to do project management and budgeting, as you said earlier. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pakamas, for sharing those insights. And I think you're very much kind of bringing up what we hear a lot about, what kind of the very challenges of being able to cross this barrier, right? In terms of larger organizations that are kind of working and not really meeting the bottom-up types of initiatives that local groups are meeting. And I see here that May shared a very interesting question that very much ties into the second thematic area that I was hoping to invite, which is linked to this principle of providing patient capital, but also kind of inviting these flexible investment mechanisms. And tying into capacities here, May was asking a bit in terms of the difficulties in responding to competitive funding calls, inviting really your reflections on an experience on how to improve direct funding to communities, or how it can be done. So maybe I can invite you to reflect a little bit about that before I dive into some of my other questions on the financing formatting part. Mel, should I start with you?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer that as best I can. Listen, I hear very well about the barriers for many groups, to access funding, and something like the Green Climate Fund. I just want to share, it was certainly no joyride in getting accreditation with the Green Climate Fund. It took Save the Children 4 or 5 years. We are the only sort of NGO there. Now there is, as you can imagine, in answering this question, more of a focus for direct access entities, which means the national, usually government, national organisations or governments being the accredited entity, which is very good, but there are of course capacity gaps there too. So the way that Save the Children operate is we typically operate in countries for the Green Climate Fund projects where there is no direct access entity, where there is no government or national entity which has gotten accreditation at this stage. Where there has been an example is the Philippines. We, Save the Children, were preparing a project, and then the Philippines have land bank, I think it's called land bank. It's pre my time, so I'm sorry, I don't know the details on this project. But then we collaborated with land bank, and we have stepped back as the accredited entity to allow that direct access national body to take the project forward, and we're bringing on board our technical assistance, our technical skills for that project. So in terms of getting money closest to the ground, I said earlier that what we try and do is use these funds that we get from the Green Climate Fund and also any co-financing that comes onto the project. For example, in Vanuatu, we have some co-financing from the Australian government. In our Solomon Island project, we will have the same. In our Mali project, we will have funding from USAID, co-financing, and there are other sources. And of course, the Green Climate Fund always asks us about the private sector. Perhaps that's one for the next question, Jonathan. I might leave that for now. So there are a couple of ways we try and do this, to get the community funding. And of course, we work also with civil society groups and women's cooperatives and farming cooperatives and schools. So we use these funds from the Green Climate Fund to build the capacity at the local level, at the institutional level also. So the government processes, their budgeting cycles, their planning cycles, to enable them to, think about the sustainability, the long-term sustainability of the project and accessing finance. We often help develop resource mobilisation plans, which is to do a landscape study on what are national, regional, international funds that are currently available, that may be available in the future. And Save the Children also has a venture capital, a very new venture capital initiative, which is, let me just look at my notes, it's called Save the Children's Global Ventures. And I can give you some examples of what that's doing by seeking investment from private sector and governments and public and private funds, and using those to work with communities on the ground on their initiatives. So the funds can go towards things like the trainings, as I've mentioned. They also go towards vocational and entrepreneurial projects. In Vanuatu, we're focused on some women's projects in particular and youth projects. So those funds go to invest in building business plans, building the capacities of what a business model looks like, whether it's a coastal product, such as it could be, for example, seaweed, the use of seaweed as a byproduct that washes up, and that's then producing something else, which could be bags or nets. In Vanuatu, it's a stop place at the moment for major cruise liners. So we're looking at partnering with the cruise liners and bringing those products onto the ships, and looking at the ways that we can build and broker those kinds of relationships with the idea to increase the income generation of the community members. The idea is that we hope we have a future where we don't keep needing to write proposals, where we don't keep needing to, look for more funds, where communities have a high level of financial security. And that may be very idealistic, but obviously we have to keep that eye on the prize, because that's what we would like to do. And in our projects, we also have capacity built on financial inclusion, financial literacy, and what that means. So those are the types of investments that the project makes, as well as adaptation packages. So that's the technologies that the farmers and fishers in these examples I've given you may need, access to resources, looking at seed banking, for example, and nurseries, for example, is more of a sustainable option. And we also look at the markets and the logistics of the markets, as well as other technologies. They could include, for example, solar dry ovens, for fish preservation, or cold storage, which could be women owned, part investment, part funded, and then women owned and operated. So there's some examples, and I hope that answers part of the question at least.
I'm very excited to hear about all of these very specific type of models, and also how you invite kind of these business development trainings. I think that's super interesting, of course. And from what I understand, one of the biggest challenges in terms of adaptation finance is leveraging this private sector investment in particular, where a lot of these kind of ways to make sure of integrate the business case, if you will, in the very strict format of understanding this to leverage these adaptation co-benefits at the least is often very much challenging. So I might pick your brains a bit on that topic a bit later if we have time. But I'm curious, Pakamas, if there's any other models or stories that come to mind from your work in terms of what are some of the ways that may be able to help kind of cross this barrier or cross this wall of being able to ensure we get direct funding to community players, and how it can be done. I know that kind of finance is not really created equally in terms of how the money is coming in, but also kind of what are the specific financial needs of different organizations in a given period of time. And so I think you have quite a big range of kind of experience with organizations that might be walking different paths or stages in terms of what they might be needing at a specific point. So are there any other examples or models to make sure they can get some of these resources?
Yeah, and also to answer some of the questions that have been sort of popped up here. I think there's this one question around whether it's NGO-led or locally led. I think it's a good question. The way when we develop projects, we don't just develop them ourselves. So as an approach, we engage with local stakeholders. So we do have local partners and implementing partners, and local NGOs who represent like local communities or informal settlements. And so before we come up with proposals, we talk with them. We ask them what sort of to be in line with the cause as well, but also to look at needs and priorities and what can be done locally, and what would fit with their interests, but also their priorities and problems. So I think that's one way of doing it, is to help sort of support locally, financial locally. And one of the barriers is also a language. We want to get community-based or local or grassroots organizations to be able to access funding themselves, but most of a lot of international calls, obviously you have to be able to write in English, and I think that's quite a big challenge. It's a big barrier, but I see the value of having an NGO to serve as a coordinator, sort of supporting local organizations to design and to develop projects that would fit with their priorities or to address their problems. I think having that. I also see, as an NGO, not just sort of accessing funding, but also to serve as a coordinator that could bring, a facilitator that could bring together multiple stakeholders who usually don't work together. So you have local NGOs to work with municipalities or to work with some of the government agencies and departments. I mean, I think having that is, I think it's working for us in a way that we can support local organizations to access support, to access funding, and yet can still do things that they're interested in or things that would address their local problems, vulnerabilities, and to come up with their own climate actions and plans. Does that answer your question? Do you have any more questions?
Sure. Well, I think it's a very complex question. Indeed, that's why we're always challenged to try to find ways to work around these arrangements. But I do know, I know that the other big principle that May was also introducing is the importance of really kind of bridging this collaboration. So I was very happy to hear about the story from Mel in the Philippines of kind of passing down the baton to a more of a national player, and what I hear from what you're saying is a bit of these kind of similar efforts to try to kind of play a bit intermediary, if you will, with more kind of grassroots level organizations. So I'm familiar with other types of projects that try to do the same. Mel, I saw you kind of jumping in your seat a bit, so I don't know if you wanted to share something in particular or just kind of taking notes, but that I would invite.
Oh, thank you. Nothing. Just I remembered another mechanism which I'm sure many of the folks here are very aware of if you're practicing practitioners, and they're the village saving and loan associations. That they've got various names, but basically. For example, in Sierra Leone, there's a Village Saving and Loan Association. These are women-run associations where groups of women have either formally, through some capacity built that was done some years back, I think by another organisation, I'm not sure who, but word of mouth has gone through, Sierra Leone, and these other VSLAs have been set up informally. And it's basically a group of women coming together and putting in some savings and then determining at the end of the month, which of the women can get those savings and then invest in what they need to invest in, which could be their traditional livelihoods, so fisheries or farming, or it could be some sort of trade. And I'm not saying that all of the products may be sustainable either, but at the moment, what we're trying to do in Sierra Leone is strengthen those and formalize them more, but also think about working with the local banks, which often won't have customers, particularly at last mile level, and who see that as too risky as well in terms of lending out money to farmers, poorer smallholder farmers, for example. But working with banks or microfinance schemes to look at climate resilient terms and conditions as well, and thinking about what that could mean. And that's fairly new, and that's something that we're experimenting a little bit with in conversations on the Sierra Leone project. So I just wanted to mention that one as well.
Great, thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting to hear the model. Well, so maybe I can just jump into the other topic that I was hoping to pick your brains a little bit, which types in a bit into kind of this cross-organizational arrangement. So I think you already begun to have a few insights into that, but really in kind of at least my understanding, kind of a lot of these challenges, and we've already begun to talk a little bit about this, of inviting co-financing, leveraging co-benefits for adaptation. There is this very important need to make sure that there's a degree of complementarity between different initiatives that are going on. And of course, the funds like the GCF are already kind of keeping that into account in the review processes of funding requests. But I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about some stories that come to mind or other things that you may be working around to make sure that we're really mainstreaming or kind of making sure that we are always keeping in mind the importance of really kind of trying to maximize the amount of co-benefit, co-financing type of complementarity in terms of project formulation, but also in terms of how different funds are being kind of channeled to support community-based adaptation activities. Mel, I know that you've also kind of been working on a few areas, I think kind of linking to that, but perhaps I can start with you just to kind of reflect a bit on some of the work that you've done. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure entirely. I mean, when we talk about co-financing on the GCF projects in particular, it's a very particular model. And, you know, we're working in areas, in countries where there's an enormous adaptation finance gap, and there's no ability at the moment to fill that. We're working in LCDs and SIDS, and that's why we're bridging that gap with these projects on a pure 100% grant basis. You know, when we're not able to work with our communities and ask them to heavily invest in any way except for their time, you know, at the moment. So the way that the Green Climate Funds project, you know, often Green Climate Fund are ask for a level of co-financing on the project from the government in particular, and that is to show a level of commitment, engagement, and skin in the game, if you like, in the project. So now, how does that co-financing work? Well, it can work in kind, so it doesn't need to be cash, it can be in kind. And when we look at in-kind contribution from government, I'm sure you all know what I mean, but just to be clear, we're talking often about seconding, you know, for example, the area council leaders, their time, and also use of public buildings, you know, public vehicles, public equipment. These are things which are an in-kind contribution to the project. And otherwise, we look for funding where we can find it. So in some instances, on some of our projects, government are contributing money towards, for example, the project management unit. So in order for us to actually have a successful project, a criteria of the GCF is that we have to have a cash-funded project implementation unit. Otherwise, you know, who is going to coordinate this project? Who's going to coordinate the independent auditing of the project as well, you know, and the monitoring and evaluation. Someone's asked about financial reporting, very strict with the GCF. There's we have to undertake a financial assessment on our government partnership, because at the government we usually have in our project Save the Children is an executing entity of the project, which is the strategic and governance oversight, and we also nominate a relevant ministry to co-execute the project with us. Now, by relevant, I mean there's no irrelevant ministry, but what I mean is it could be, you know, the Ministry of Health, if it's a health project, as we are seeing in Laos and as we are seeing in Malawi on our projects. And so that's the way that we operate, and the co-financing is it's a big gap. You know, many of our projects, at the moment, I have mentioned Vanuatu is being co-financed with parallel funding from the Australian government. The same with the Solomons. On some of the other projects like Sierra Leone, we may get project money from the UK government, FCDO. So it's still a lot of public monies, you know, and there are, as I mentioned, the venture fund that Save the Children is setting up. Increasingly, we're looking at how to attract private sector investment in more ways. And that investment can go into things like, you know, agricultural technologies, water efficiency and irrigation technologies. It can go into renewable technologies, you know, that we've talked about. It could go into food chain you know, like the preservation and cold storage technologies, the operation and maintenance of that. There's insurance schemes, as you know, we're also involved in insurance with the START network and ARC. So yeah, there's different ways to try and finance, but no one is you know, without a doubt of understanding that there's a massive adaptation finance gap. And I actually wrote a paper on this, which I'm happy to share afterwards, Jonathan, with you and all participants. But that actually was commissioned by the ACT Alliance, which is an interfaith group that works globally and is being very vocal at the moment, well, has always been, but at the moment on loss and damage. And I wrote a paper on the architecture of climate finance post 2025 for the last COP that was circulated. And in that, we talk about the kinds of barriers that we've talked about here in accessing finance and those who need it most on the ground. But also we mentioned that locally led adaptation has to play a role in climate finance mechanisms. And all of our projects that Save the Children, the current 12, and the 250 million that we will be accessing from the Green Climate Fund are all locally led adaptation projects, instilling many of the principles that we've just talked about.
Thank you for sharing that, Mel. And I was very inspired to learn about ACT Alliance's efforts, really, and kind of also from that interview I referenced to earlier, there was another quote that comes to mind where the impact investor was talking a lot about the importance of being agnostic in terms of what are the different types of partnerships that may need to be forged in order to be able to create investment kind of arrangements to really kind of make impact on the ground, right? And so I think your story kind of brings a lot about that kind of interesting perspective of engaging with faith-based organizations. And I just wanted to invite Pakamas to kind of also kind of pick up on this and maybe share a few stories or reflections, because I'm sure you've come across many moments in which kind of communities are always, when in places where resources are constrained, very creative in trying to work together in order to address need situations. And very curious to hear your perspective in terms of some of the activities that you've come across kind of at communities across Thailand to really work across and be agnostic again in terms of forging this type of collaborations between different individuals or industries or different players to kind of make sure that there are you know, activities that are bridged when there are kind of this gap in being able to access resources.
Well, we have probably one example actually, that so we were working in Hajai City for the ASEAN program, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, funded by Rockefeller. That we had, you know, as a core partners for the program, the Chamber of Commerce and like basically the business and private sector of in Hajai, and they were, I mean, they were really engaged in the project, and I think it became a success because then they actually co-financed, they contributed to investing in this early warning system. I think this is quite rare in all of the work I've done, you know, in Thailand, but also in the Mekong countries, working in cities and getting local stakeholders to contribute to actually finance some of the interventions or some of the actions. But yeah, so I mean, it worked, and I think it's been, and it's also sustainable. So the work that we did, you know, it was, I mean, ASEAN went on for 7 years, so that was one of the longest projects. But the local stakeholders were so engaged that they continue to work together beyond the project. And you know, the working group, we call them the city working group. They still meet up, they still work together, they still collaborate, but working on different issues and challenges. You know, and I think the latest problem was the pandemic, and the working group that came under ASEAN came together to you know, to work out the issues of locking down and how to recover from COVID and opening up for businesses and all that. It's all led by the business sector. So I think it can be done. It's just having to find the right entry points and I mean for the ASEAN program, I think that it was just lucky that we found the right combination, you know, of local stakeholders that came together and they worked well together and they continue to work together. And for them to get the business sector to invest in this early warning system. So that's just one example. But yes, I mean, I think co-financing is important. The way we approach it is that when local stakeholders come, you know, they design and develop actions or action plans. Some of those actions we sort of go back to municipalities and sort of getting them to integrate some of these actions and plans into their budget planning. So that's the approach we do it. But some of the, I mean, responses we've had here in Thailand is that it's also to do with the national level, you know, even though there is a national adaptation plan, but it's not really integrated or it's not mainstreamed, it's not actually implemented at the local level. So when we talk about climate adaptation with municipalities, some of the, I mean, it's quite difficult for them to integrate actions for their budget planning without the national level policy. So that's one of the barriers. But at least, you know, we get the municipalities to think through what can be done in terms of addressing climate vulnerabilities and what kind of adaptation plans they could do. And you know, hopefully they can at least adapt or adopt some of the thinking into their planning. So that, yeah, that's how we would approach these co-financing mechanisms at the local level.
Could I just pick up on a point straight after that? Because it's a really important point you're making about the coordination with the national climate policies or the nationally determined contributions, or the NAPAs, the national adaptation plans, which are built at the national levels, often not in a highly consultative manner, and have a range of actions and are underfunded. We know that there's a gap there. So this is also, I'm really pleased to hear the work that you've been talking about. This is also part of our projects where we align the project with the nationally determined contributions, which are under, you know, the UNFCCC, and any national adaptation planning. And we build capacity on the NDCs and the NAPAs at the local level, so that local, you know, civil society and residents, you know, who are climate vulnerable, are also, you know, educated and have their awareness raised on, you know, this need for national priorities. You know, what are the national priorities and where is the meeting point with the local priorities? So we also build that into all of our projects. And I forgot to mention that, you know, Save the Children, obviously, it's such a large organization. It has its own fundraising arm, you would imagine, and, you know, partnership brokerage. And that's highly effective. And we're trying to make it more effective. So that we do have private sector funding at that level. And what we are trying to do with our climate projects in terms of local adaptation is actually, you know, attract more private financing, which is highly relevant. So if, for example, again, we have a health project, we would like to provide, for example, GSK, you know, major pharma organization, are investing in our Green Climate Fund portfolio. And we're trying to link, you know, so if we need like a cold vaccine program, for example, or cold storage program for vaccines, or building in, you know, improving, retrofitting infrastructure as we are in Laos for health clinics, or in Malawi where we're trying to build health surveillance systems which are linked to, you know, increasing you know, it could be increasing of dengue that we're seeing recently, for example, or more diarrheal related illnesses because of flooding and poor water, health and sanitation, then we're trying to link, you know, with private sector partners and provide them with the story, you know, what's going on in Laos at that local community when a climate event hits or because of the changing climate. So we do have private sector engagement there, and we're just trying to improve that engagement to get more investment in these projects on the ground.
That's exciting to hear. And of course, there is kind of that value of being able to kind of have that network and build upon it. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for all of the work you are doing. It's very impressive. I'm just cognizant of time, and it's already almost an hour and a half. We have a few questions from participants that I've received. So unfortunately, I don't think we have enough time to go through them, but I can try to maybe see if we can get some answers to them later on. But I see here one of the questions that are brought, I think is kind of interesting in terms of actually inviting one of the challenges that many small communities face. I see Deo is asking about different ways that may be doing to bridge the gap between local staffing capacities to carry on activities that in some cases maybe small communities may be facing to actually implement and coordinate projects. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts also on kind of what might be some approaches to bridge that. Pakamas, maybe I start with you since you work a lot kind of on the ground. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, I think it is, I mean, it's a good question. It's always a challenge, you know, getting people to do additional work, mainly. I mean, I think the way we approach it is that we, when we engage with local communities or community organizations, local stakeholders, we have to find the right entry point, getting them engaged in something that they have in common, a common problem. So with climate projects, we go through this whole process of dialogues and getting them engaged in the issues around, not just understanding what climate impacts are, but how impacts, how they would, be impacted directly. And then, so through that process, so it is, I think as an engagement process, it's also a capacity building process that would go together, and which is time consuming. But this is why you need, I think, the benefit of having long-term projects as well. You have time to do that, but also we work with existing networks as well. So it's not doing something from scratch, but building on what we've had in terms of networks and engaged stakeholders. And so once they have that, once they are engaged in something that important to them, would address their priorities or their needs or their problems, then it's not so much as a challenge getting them to work together and to act on something in terms of identifying solutions or addressing climate vulnerabilities. But yes, I mean, it's a process of engagement and capacity building that need both at the same time.
Very, very, thank you for sharing that thoughts. I don't know, Mel, if you want to add any thoughts to Pakamas in these notes.
Not too much. I think that's exactly the approach. It's not, I mean, this is a universal problem, isn't it? And it's something that we flag as a risk in all of our projects. Staff turnover, under capacity, which can affect the project, it can delay the project, it can reduce the quality of the project. So the way that we're trying to address that capacity is, when we co-design these projects with the communities, the GCF, and we have the government sign off at the highest level, that is a commitment, and the commitment we expect is that there will be a reprioritization as much as possible and an investment in resources. And the GCF funds obviously help that become a possibility in the beginning. But of course, the project is not forever. The project lasts for 5, 6, 7 years, depending. So what we have to do is build in, you know, a sustainable solution so that we're not hiring someone for 5 years and then that role doesn't exist anymore. No, that role has to continue. That role has to be built into the local adaptation plans and policies that we're developing with the communities, or that the communities are developing themselves with our technical assistance and support. So those roles have to be built into the budgets, into the planning cycles of the national adaptation plans and the local adaptation plans. Without that, without the terms and conditions, without the job descriptions, then it will be impossible to continue, because climate is changing, will continue to change, and these roles are necessary.
Very much so, and I know that this general topic is going to be one of the key areas that is expected to be discussed in the upcoming Conference of the Parties for under the UNFCCC. I'm very curious, if I were to ask you what is one key message that you would like to project out to our participants, but to anyone who may be following these conversations and that points, and from your experience, what may be one of these kind of key takeaways or kind of invitations for bridging really kind of a call to collective action to kind of create but easier access for communities to control financial resources in this case. Maybe Mel, should I start with you? I see Pakamas, I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer, to be honest, and I don't know a key takeaway on bridging the financial adaptation gap. I said earlier, I wrote this paper, which I'll share in the chat, where we make 7 recommendations just on that, you know, how to bridge it at a very local level. It requires collaboration, a lot of collaboration, and these communities require assistance, and that assistance includes a lot of capacity building. Most of our projects are 75, 80% capacity building, and then investment in some, you know, hard small scale infrastructure and the like. But yeah, there needs to be increased awareness, linkage between the local to the provincial to the national governments needs to improve. I'm not sure if I have a key takeaway. We're working hard as we can to get the monies on the ground, but each of the projects take a long time to develop. They are highly consultative, which they need to be, because the country owns them. Save the Children doesn't own these projects. But yeah, I don't have a single silver bullet solution, I'm afraid. We just try and address it from all the different ways that I've mentioned in this call. There's a lot of different avenues that we partner, we build capacity, we look for financing elsewhere. We develop entrepreneurial skills at the community level and business plans to support change. Yeah, I can't give you one single answer, but hopefully there's been some helpful things that I've mentioned along here.
No worries, and sorry to put you on the spot with such a broad and tough question to answer. It's indeed a very complex challenge, so no worries. Thank you for all of your insights and great examples. So looking forward to reading your paper also to dive into this. Pakamas, I don't know if you want to share one last thoughts. I won't pass on to you into that question, but before we close.
Well, you know, I agree with Mel. I think she just said it really well. But also something about climate adaptation that sounds so technical to me, and you know, to a lot of grassroots or community-based organizations. I mean, I think I don't know if you can, in terms of bridging, is that how to, you know, so that climate adaptation is not perceived or seen as something isolated, standalone thing. I think it's got to be somehow relate to development, to for local communities to understand that it applies to them. It's not just something out there for academics or for scientific community. And I think that's also an important gap and a challenge that climate adaptation would have to address local context, but also the root causes of vulnerabilities that are to do with like social political structures or challenges at the local context. And I think so. It's not too technical. It's not really just about looking at climate projections and scenarios, but what's happening on the ground as well. I don't know if that helps or makes it more difficult, but yeah, yes.
Thank you so much for saying that, because that's a great note to end the conversation. I really think adaptation and resilience building is very much a people's problem, and everybody should be able to take part of that discussion. So thank you again for sharing us some of your insights and experience and stories from your work. And I hope that everyone who's on the other end of the screen listening to the conversation found this as interesting as I did. And is hopefully going to help us out to carry on this conversation in your own networks, and to make this again very much a people conversation that everybody can engage. I must close the session as we've come down to our hour and a half already. My colleague Asmita is sharing a short form to invite your feedback on this session and also your thoughts. So please do take a moment before stepping out to fill that and give us your thoughts. And thank you for your attention for the past hour and a half. We hope this was useful and interesting to you. We know it's a very challenging topic to dive into. So thank you again to May for kind of briefing us on how to wrap our heads around this, and again to Imelda and Pakamas for bringing this kind of to the table in a tangible way of understanding what is really going on in different levels to bridge that. So we'll be storing this session in again in the Asia Pacific Adaptation Information Platform for future reference. And we hope you can stay tuned for further opportunities to kind of carry on this conversation down the line. Thank you again for all you do, and we hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.